So what are shutter speeds? Shutter speeds are a unit of shutter duration or time, which is of course used in camera exposure. However, shutter speeds control another element, that of subject movement. This control over movement allows an extensive creative control and input by the photographer. That is, when you know how to use the visual controls effectively and for creative impact. This slide illustrates the shutter speed range in full stop increments. We discussed this concept in a previous lecture. You may of course find other shutter speeds within the camera's system because cameras allow half or third stop increments. This means that there will be another shutter speed between each full stop for half stop increments, or a further 2 shutter speeds for third stop increments. You can set the desired incremental stop range between shutter speeds and f-stop on most digital SLRs. The important message here for this lecture is these are the standard shutter speed range in full stop increments. The 2-second exposure is naturally a longer duration than the 1/4000th. While 1/4000 simply written as 4000 is a larger number, remember it represents a fraction of a second and a very short time and less exposure. Let's just have a look at this sample image of a seascape. The image is of a seascape scene with rocks in the foreground, the ocean in the middle field and the sky in the background. I guess a typical scene on the water's edge and all the elements clearly identified. This image was shot at 1/1000th of a second shutter speed. Now let's look at this image. Same location, however there is something very different about this image compared to the previous. This image was captured at a full 5 seconds. The rocks in the foreground appear very much the same, however there is a striking difference in the way the water is represented. The water does not appear as it looks in real life. It appears more like a mist or a fog over the rocks. Why does this image appear so differently? If we compare both images, we can see this difference very clearly. Because the shutter remains open for a set period of time, in other words, the shutter speed, the camera will record objects that entire time. In the 1/1000th of a second image, the water moves very little during that short duration. However, in a 5-second exposure, the water would move quite significantly over that time. Because the camera is recording for the entire duration, the water becomes a soft, diffuse appearance rather than that sharp, crisp image in the first image. What these images are designed to show you is that the selection of shutter speeds has a dramatic and creative effect on the overall result. Shutter speeds can record subjects in a variety of appearances. The trick is, of course, to understand how the shutter can affect the visual appearance and to record this or control this effect creatively. This image by American photographer Annie Leibovitz is a stunning example of the control of shutter speed and how the right setting adds impact. This image is of US President Richard Nixon leaving the White House after his resignation in 1974. There is a symbolic notion of the show is over by the rolling up of the carpet and suggesting the White House is no longer open for the soon-to-be ex-president. The image design is striking, with the placement of the 3 Marines and the helicopter. The tonal relationship also all work wonderfully. However, the shutter speed is also absolutely perfect. While it freezes the action of the Marines, the carpet blowing over them, and the helicopter to appear all pin sharp, the rotor blades on the chopper display movement. It is this perfect combination of frozen sharp appearance for most subjects while displaying movement in other areas like the rotor blades. Now, it's unlikely that Leibovitz did any testing to get the perfect shutter speed for this shot. However, the important message is when you shoot a lot of images, you instinctively know what the right shutter speed is. It is a feeling you get which is consistent with a lot of other creative processes. I have prepared some sample photographs to demonstrate the effects of movement on moving subjects. These 6 images are actually photographs, not diagrams, although they look very diagrammatic. The photographs are all of the same subject, a test target made for this purpose. The test target was placed on a turntable a record player for those who remember this technology, and photographed at various shutter speeds. I used the turntable to keep the subject at a constant speed, 33 RPMs or 33 revolutions per minute. Each result illustrates how the same object appears quite differently when using longer or shorter shutter speeds. The top row shows significant movement, while the last image, the 1/2000th of a second, makes the target look like it isn't moving at all. As I previously mentioned, all subjects are moving at the same speed in all images. So what does this mean for us photographers? Well, let's get some general rules established and then look at how we can use them creatively. In most general photography, we choose a shutter speed that prevents subject blurring. The shutter speed will obviously vary with different subjects moving at different speeds. And in fact, there are three concepts to consider with subject movement. The variation includes the speed of the subject, the direction of the subject, and the distance of the subject. Subjects that are at greater distances appear slower than when they are in close proximity. The subjects moving left to right of the frame, or right to left, appear faster than subjects moving towards or away from the camera. Speed is relative depending upon distance and direction. Other factors may influence the selection of shutter speeds include the required depth of field or f-stop selection, whether the camera is handheld or mounted onto a tripod or camera stand, or other camera handling considerations like using an extremely long focal length lens. This image by Vanessa Baker shows how important selecting the right shutter speed for each subject is. Again, there is a combination of frozen still components within the important areas of the subject, yet movement of the air being pushed through the water and swirling that water. This is a nice way of showing the action without unacceptable blur. It is also a display of very nice symmetrical balance in the image composition. If you divide the image down the center vertically, it is perfectly balanced, a nice application of symmetry. This is one of my favourite photographs by Deanne Arbus, and along with her identical twins image, it is certainly her best known image. This is handheld medium format photography, and it is important to use a shutter speed that 1. Can eliminate camera shake caused by the operator, and 2. Make sure the subject does not blur through subject movement. It was most likely shot around 1/25th of a second to 1/500th of a second, and using a higher shutter speed allows for a wider open aperture that provides a shallow depth of field, which we can see in this image too. The power of this image is the focus on the centre of interest, the boy, his expression, his demeanour, especially the way he's holding his hands, and the presence of the hand grenade. The tension that's created in this image provides just such a wonderful, rich narrative. This image by Alberto Bacura is a very interesting one. If you have a closer look, it is actually not what it seems. The person dressed in the lingerie is actually a mannequin, and you can also notice a reflection over the whole image. It is actually a photograph of a window display, and while all the subject matter is not going to move and produce unwarranted blur, the lighting conditions are the available light within the display with low levels of illumination. 1. If the camera is handheld, use a shutter speed that will avoid camera shake. A higher ISO setting could also help achieve this faster shutter speed. Or 2. Use a slower shutter speed in combination with a tripod. You can see the photographer's legs in the window's reflection, and I cannot see any reflection of a tripod, so I expect the first option was used. However, you can never tell in today's world of Photoshop. Fast action sports photography requires fast shutter speeds to freeze the action. This image was most likely shot between 1/1000th of a second to 4/1000th of a second to stop that fast moving action. Freezing of the action or using fast shutter speeds is a common technique for most action style photography. This wonderful image by Stephen Shaw obviously does not require a similar fast shutter speed to the previous image because the subject matter is stationary. Shaw shot a lot of his work with large format cameras, and a tripod is a must with this type of camera equipment. This image displays a strong sense of colour design, especially the contrast between the warm and cool tones. Shaw's work often features banal subject matter with no presence of people, just objects within space. A strong sense of colour is also a recognisable feature of his work, and this image is a great example. This image is similar to Shaw's previous one in that it is a solid, immovable object as the centre of interest. However, Benet's image also has people in the frame, so the selection of the shutter speed will also need to consider the movement of the people. Alternatively, you can have a very long exposure and any moving people will completely disappear, unless of course they remain stationary. This is a very strong composition with the dominant centre of interest in the third section of the frame. The rule of thirds works, and it's something you should consider and practice. This early photograph by Daguerre himself, the inventor of the daguerreotype, was shot in Paris in 1838, and it shows the effect of slow shutter speeds in crowded streets. The only visible person we see is the man getting a shoe shine because he's stationary while his shoes are being shined. It is most likely this scene had several people walking through it while the camera was exposing, and in addition to traffic on the road. However, due to the slow shutter speed, anything that was moving does not record. Camera shake is generally something we try very hard to avoid. It is caused by using too slow a shutter speed and the camera moves or shakes while making the exposure. Other camera shake issues may arise when poor camera holding methods are used, and especially with long focal length lenses, when photographers press the shutter release button too hard or in a sudden action and jolt the camera. Internal vibration, especially from the camera's mirror, is commonly a problem with macro photography under larger magnifications. The slight degree of movement is noticeable in the image. This is an image suffering from camera shake. Everything in the image is blurred, caused by the camera moving while taking the exposure. Have a close look and learn how to recognize the difference between camera shake and subject movement. Understanding these differences will assist in problem solving when images are not just sharp enough and you need to find out why. The list you see here on the screen is a range of camera shake solutions for the causes earlier listed. When hand-holding cameras, it is important to use a shutter speed at least 1/60th of a second to 1/25th of a second. For longer lenses, you need to increase that minimum shutter speed. When you are pressing the shutter release button, use a gentle squeeze rather than a quick stab motion. Your shutter release technique is actually more important than you may realize, and try practicing a little while paying attention to how you are actually using this function. Alternatively, you can use a cable release or set the camera on self-timer, which allows the camera to settle before taking exposures. For macro photography work, a function called mirror lockup can be used to eliminate internal vibration. This function in Canon digital SLR cameras can be found in the Special Functions menu. Mirror lockup function should be combined with a cable accessory, and the function has two press function or two phases. The first press of the shutter release locks up the mirror, while the second press is needed to fire the shutter. Naturally, you allow some time for the camera to settle and any vibrations disappear before you press the final shutter release. Camera stands are critical equipment for serious photography, and they allow slower shutter speeds to be used without camera shake. There are a variety of types of camera stands available, including tripods, monopods, studio stands, and copy stands. Tripods are also available for loan with camera kits, and we strongly encourage students to use them. So let's summarize the factors influencing subject movement that we have discussed so far. Camera shutter speed selection is the most critical factor affecting subject movement. Slower the speed, greater the subject movement. Faster the shutter speed, less subject movement. The speed, the direction, and the distance of the subject. Whether the camera is handheld or mounted onto a tripod or other camera support. and a technique called camera panning, which we will soon discuss. We are now going to discuss methods to visually emphasize movement in still photography. The concept is a little strange because movement is not a physical concept in still photography, but a representation of motion. We'll discuss methods involving both fast and slow shutter speeds. When action is captured at the most dramatic point while using a fast shutter speed, the drama or peak of action is emphasized. This is a common application in action-type imagery like sports photography. Capturing the peak of action is more difficult than it seems and requires a connection with the action itself. It is purely an instinctive attribute that some photographers have, while others don't have that great connection with their subjects. Cartier-Bresson described this connection with subjects as the decisive moment, the point when action is at its most dramatic and the compositional elements all fall into place. Using a mode of multiple frames per second is a useful tool to capture the peak of action. However, it does not take place of great instincts. Let's examine several images that display this concept of peak of action. This image by news photographer Jeff Amp demonstrates the impact of point of action. The timing of the image, just as the horse has made contact with the ground, adds to the tension in an implied way. In other words, we can quickly anticipate that the fate of the following movement is going to be highly dangerous or disastrous. The fast shutter speed produces drama and movement because the subject is frozen in time and space. Peak of action emphasizes drama and, in this case, the tragic. The strong use of the diagonal of the horse and juxtaposed against the strong horizontal lines of the fence or rails behind also adds to the sense of movement and drama. Composing images in a diagonal format can often add to the notion of speed and drama. This historic photograph of the Hindenburg disaster in 1937 shows the peak of action as the airship explodes. The plumes of flames are at their peak of intensity and the impending disaster is clearly felt by the viewer. The strong use of the diagonal is again seen in this image, which reinforces the sense of movement, and the position of the pylon within the rule of thirds also adds to the composition of the image. Even in split-second photography, composition matters. Jacques-Henri Latigue's work at the turn of the 20th century had a strong emphasis of movement and peak of action. Advancements in film technology allowed for the first time to shoot with higher shutter speeds due to the increased level of film sensitivity and greater lens design. Latigue exploits the concept of freezing the subject in mid-air. This image highlights his work recording the daily life of his family and the world around him. This image of his cousin was taken when Latigue was around 11 years old and with a very basic camera by today's standards. The image design shows the subject captured in mid-air by using a relatively fast shutter speed. There is some movement in the subject, particularly the subject's hands. There is also a strong sense or application of diagonals in this image too. The handrail running through the center of the frame and the opposing diagonals made by the steps add to the image drama and impact. It also adds to the sense of motion and movement. The center of interest is also positioned within the frame using the rule of thirds. Death of a Loyalist Soldier by Robert Capa is a photograph taken during the Spanish Civil War. It depicts the moment when the Loyalist soldier was shot and killed. The peak of action is depicted by the stance of the subject and how the rifle is suspended in mid-air or leaving his hands. There remains some controversy regarding the authenticity of this image and whether it was staged by Capa rather than capturing the reality. Nevertheless, it is a good example of the impact of peak of action. André Cortez is known as the photographer's photographer. I describe his style as a formalist, and he is certainly a great photographer to study if you're learning composition. This image by Cortez illustrates peak of action perfectly. The shot is taken at the exact moment the dancers have reached the height of their jump, and the action is at its most intense drama. The background in this image is beautiful, and there are some composition lessons to learn from here too. The main centre of interest, the ballerina closest to the camera or second from the left, is positioned within the thirds intersection. The repetition of shape of all the four ballerinas provides a sense of unity. We see them as a group, and the applied line from the spectator leads the eye back into the frame and into or onto the centre of interest. This is a wonderful street or documentary photograph. It wasn't set up. Curtiz actually found this situation while walking through the streets. Photographers are always great opportunists. The general rule for photography is to use a shutter speed that eliminates subject blur and camera shake. In other words, to use a fast enough shutter speed and capture subjects that appear sharp. While this is certainly true for most photographic tasks, it is not the complete story. Creating movement through the application of slower shutter speeds also offers another creative dimension. This image of Ernst Haas is a great example of how to break the rules creatively. Haas has used a slow shutter speed to capture the subject movement and increase the drama in the image by using camera shake. He moved the camera deliberately to produce this effect. The strong colours make this technique work even better, and the result is similar to an Impressionist style. I also suspect that the concept of Impressionist painting may have originally been inspired by blurry photographs, but that's my view. This image by Andreas Feininger illustrates the effect of how moving lights are recorded when long exposure times are used. They become light trails. The lights on the helicopter's rotor blades cause the spiraling shape as they spin when the helicopter flies off. Another Haas image using a slow shutter speed while the flight of the bird is recorded. This is a very elegant photograph with enough detail of the bird to interpret the subject content. However, the motion expressed in the blur is absolutely beautiful. It is soft and expresses motion and flight. The application of monochromatic colour or the colour palette is also visually stunning. This is a self-portrait by American fashion photographer Richard Avedon. The slow shutter speed has introduced blur in his moving arms. This is a deliberate effect by Avedon, and it produces an expressive portrait. However, I'm not quite sure of the meaning. Maybe you can interpret its meaning more effectively. The white background is a signature of Avedon's portraits, and some other photographers too, but it's mostly contributed to Avedon. The white signature background is certainly an appropriate prop in this self-portrait. This is a wonderful image by photojournalist Simon Norfolk of a bullet-scarred building and car in a war-torn location somewhere in the Middle East. The slow shutter speed capturing the movement of the herd of the sheep in the foreground adds tremendously to the image design. It proves that all blur is not a bad thing in image design. However, it does have to add something to the image. In most cases it doesn't, but it certainly does in this image. This image by Amy Heller is another way to portray subject movement. It is a sequence of images using strobe lighting. It doesn't relate to shutter speeds, except the speed or duration of the flash actually becomes the effective shutter speed. Nevertheless, it is an interesting image that depicts movement beautifully, and it's a great idea. Sebastião Salgado is a contemporary photojournalist genius. He began his career as an economist for the World Bank and took photographs to support his reports. Salgado has a wonderful eye for images and a wonderful sense of humanity. This photograph was taken in a Bombay train station. The application of a slow shutter speed to show the movement of the commuters in a hustle and bustle of a crowded transport system is simply brilliant. The blur adds meaning to this image. This is an abstract image by William Klein. He used a long exposure while rotating several painted panels. The result is an interesting abstract that can be defined by movement, shape, and tone. This image is another example of light trails using a long shutter speed. The lights become lines due to the rotation of the Ferris wheel. These images are absolutely great fun to do and visually stunning. They do, of course, require a tripod. This is the same idea as the previous image. However, Smith ties lights to a piece of string and while spinning them rotates in a circle to create these orb-like structures. The different colours are achieved by placing gels over small torches or LED lighting. The shutter speeds are long and set on B settings. In addition to the shutter speeds we mentioned earlier in this lecture, there is another shutter speed setting called B setting. The B setting, which originates from bulb, is a shutter setting that allows you to keep the shutter open for any duration. Most digital SLRs have a maximum shutter speed of around 30 seconds. So how can we take exposures of say 45 seconds or even into the minutes? The answer is you can use the B setting. When you press the shutter release button on B setting, the shutter will remain open for as long as you keep the button pressed in. This function obviously requires a tripod and a cable release, so you don't move the camera when you press the shutter release with your finger. Cable releases also have a locking mechanism, so for exposures into the minutes or even the hours, you do not have to keep your finger pressing on the release button, just apply the lock. Check out your camera and see if you can locate where the B setting is. Long exposure photography has recently become popular with digital technology. This type of work has a certain aesthetic and is a lot of fun to shoot. This image by Mikko Lagerstedt is a great example. The misty effect of the waves over the rocks and the bright stars in the sky makes the image surreal. Long exposure photography requires long exposures over several seconds, minutes, and sometimes even hours. You need to set the shutter speed on B, mount the camera on a tripod, and use a cable release. Higher ISO ratings are also used in some night photography to record the stars, while ND or neutral density filters are often applied in scenes that are too bright to enable long exposure times. This is another night photograph by Liccardi. The time for this exposure would most likely be several hours during the night. The circular star trails are caused by the long exposure time and the rotation of the Earth. The center of the circular star trails are the North or South Pole. A more successful method of shooting this type of work, rather than a single long exposure, is image stacking with multiple exposures. Shorter exposures at higher ISO ratings is sometimes a better option. This is a typical image we see with long exposure photography. Seascapes with milky soft water and clouds that blur with movement. This work works very well with black and white photography. Moving water and especially waterfalls are a popular subject topic for long exposure photography. Moving water turns into soft mist, or in the case of waterfalls, sometimes it looks like spilling sand. The debate about photographic truth has interesting results when discussing photographs of waterfalls. Because photographers understand how shutter speeds can be used to provide creative input into the results, what is the true representation of a waterfall? Should the water be frozen still by using a fast shutter speed, or misty and soft by using a slow shutter speed? What is the reality? Well, of course, none. It is up to us photographers to make it what we want. That is, once you understand the control over the results using different shutter speeds. Another way to introduce movement and create a different visual effect is a method called panning. Panning is the deliberate moving of the camera in the same direction as the subject motion, while using a relatively slower shutter speed. Pan images allow the subject to record with reduced blur at the lower shutter speed, while blurring stationary subjects or subjects moving in a different direction. This technique can isolate the subject in a sharp versus blur and it may also create a sense of movement or, more importantly, speed. This example on the screen shows how the bike and passenger are relatively sharp. There is some subject movement, while the foreground and background regions are significantly blurred. The blurring effect adds to the sense of speed by providing a representation of movement. Nothing in the still image is, of course, moving. However, the representation of movement is certainly seen in the image. Also note the wheels. Because they are moving in a circular motion rather than horizontally across the frame, they record with an increase of blur, which actually adds to the representation of speed. The bike can appear somewhat more faster than it is actually travelling. The method of panning is very simple. Select a relatively slower shutter speed, 1/15th to 1/60th of a second. This will depend, of course, upon the speed and the distance of the subject. Pan the camera at the same rate as the subject in a smooth action. This action should be similar to a golf or tennis swing. This analogy means the panning technique should have a backswing and a follow-through. The panning should start sometime before the subject and continue as the subject passes. A smooth panning action is critical to avoid camera shake in another direction due to a jerky technique or an abrupt start and end. Practice is essential to get good panning results. These two images illustrate the difference between the panning method and a faster shutter speed. The 1/60th of a second image provides a greater sense of representation of speed than the frozen still 1/1000th of a second shot. I hope you are starting to get some perspective regarding the scope of creativity with different selection options of shutter speeds. Understanding how to manipulate the image is the beginning of opening up a range of creative options. Great photographs are not measured and remembered by their technical quality, but more so for their ideas and level of creativity. This is a great example to illustrate this point. One of my favourite images, and yes, I do have many. I want you to study this image and see if you can describe how the photographer has produced a wonderful sense of motion. The representation of movement has significant influence on the meaning of this photograph. It illustrates the functionality of the ride or allows some perspective of the function of the change suspended in midair. We immediately understand that what this action is about and how the ride actually works. The chairs suspended on chains make sense because we experience or have seen these carnival rides before. The sense of movement also plays a key role in developing the concept of recreation, fun, danger, and thrill-seeking. The notion of speed and movement plays a critical role in understanding these elements of the image, or at the very least enhances the concept and meaning. Why is the background blurry while the people sitting on the chairs still? Because the motion of the swing itself does the panning. The camera and the people are moving at the same direction. A very simple but effective idea and great image design. Now we come to a more technical component of shutter speeds, flash synchronization. There are essentially two types of lighting we use in photography: ambient light, daylight, and tungsten lighting, which is continuous, and electronic flash, which has a short burst of light. There are also two basic types of electronic flash: portable flash, which attaches to or is inbuilt into the camera, and studio flash. Studio flash are larger units and allow a range of reflectors or light shapers to change the quality of light. Photomedia students will be shooting in the studio with this type of professional flash equipment in the second year of the degree. For now, however, what is important is to understand the concept of flash synchronization. On cameras with focal plane shutters, a certain shutter speed is required that syncs the firing of the flash, and this actual speed changes with different camera models. Let's have a look at some results of different shutter speeds. I have shot this subject using studio flash at different shutter speed settings. The flash synchronization speed for this camera is 1/250th of a second. Now if we look at this image, it does not display any obvious light cutoff. This result is the same for the slower shutter speed at 1/160th of a second. However, the next shot at 1/320th of a second displays some light cutoff on the right hand side of the image. The degree of cutoff increases significantly when the shutter speed becomes faster, and in the 1/1000th of a second image there is very little subject visible. The dark cutoff regions is the shutter blades covering the sensor when the flash fires. The flash synchronization speed is the shutter speed that fires when the sensor frame is fully exposed and opened. Let's have a look at some diagrams to explain. Focal plane shutters are designed to provide faster shutter speeds like 1/4000th of a second. They work by combining two curtains that follow each other and travel across the film plane. Higher shutter speeds are actually artificially produced by exposing the sensor or film through the slit between each curtain. Faster shutter speeds are achieved by altering the width of the slit. The more narrow the opening that travels across the film plane, the relatively faster the speed. The top row of this diagram illustrates how fast shutter speeds are achieved by the slit moving across the film plane. This method is only with focal plane shutters. The bottom row shows a shutter speed that has a width between the front and rear curtains that actually exposes the whole of the frame before the rear curtain commences its journey across the film plane. It is at this point when the flash is fired. The timing between the shutter width being completely open and the firing of the flash is called the flash synchronization. Each camera with focal plane shutters, and that's pretty much all digital SLR cameras today, has a certain shutter speed that synchronizes with the firing of electronic flash. This speed is called the flash synchronization speed. When using electronic flash, portable or studio, the flash synchronization speed, or slower, but definitely not higher, must be selected to avoid the cutoff seen in these images. It is not a difficult technical consideration. However, if you are getting this type of cutoff when using flash, you now know what the solution is. These are some bullet points covering what I've just suggested and included in your notes. Portable flash is a great tool for providing illumination in locations and situations where low light will not allow you to take an image. The problem with flash, however, is that it often produces a black or very dark background against a very bright lit subject. What photographers often do to prevent this look is to lower the shutter speed in combination with a wider open aperture, so that some of the ambient light in the background provides some detail and allows some context through the background information. Increasing the ISO can also help with this process. This is what Jason Locus has done in this image of a boxing bout. What can happen when you use slower shutter speeds with focal plane shutters and flash is a condition called ghosting. You can see in this image a second or ghost image also appearing, especially in the boxing gloves. This effect has actually added to the concept of action and motion and has worked very well in a creative sense. In other situations, it may not be so successful. The point here is, ghosting is an effect of slow shutter speeds when using flash and focal plane shutters. Some modern portable flash units have a rear curtain firing option to avoid ghosting issues. See your camera and flash manual for further details if you are affected by this artifact. This well-known image by Jacques-Henri Letigue in 1912 of the French Grand Prix, a little different to modern Grand Prix, also shows an artifact caused by focal plane shutters. If you look at the rear wheel, its shape is significantly distorted. This distortion or effect is called focal plane distortion. We don't actually see this artifact very much today. However, what is interesting in this effect, it has made the image quite famous and adds to the concept of speed, especially for 1912. The spectators leaning in the opposite direction also adds to the brilliance of this image, or a complete accident, of course. Leaf shutters are another type of shutter found in cameras. They are usually positioned within the lens and work differently to focal plane shutters. Leaf shutters work by an iris diaphragm that opens and closes at the speed rate indicated by the shutter speed. For example, a 1/125th of a second shutter opens and closes at 1/125th of a second. This is true with all other shutter speeds. Due to the physical speed of opening and closing, the 1/1500th of a second shutter speed is the maximum speed possible with leaf shutters, unlike focal plane shutters, which can get up to 10 and 12 thousandths of a second. The biggest advantage, however, with leaf shutters is that there is no flash synchronization speed, which has significant advantages when using fill flash techniques in strong light to control contrast. So what have we covered this lecture? We know that shutter speeds control exposure through time. Shutter speeds also provide creative control on how the subject may appear based on how the subject moves. Subject movement varies depending upon speed, direction, and distance. In most applications, we select a shutter speed to avoid camera shake, and we can use camera supports such as tripods, monopods, and copy stands for long exposures. By increasing ISO rating, we can also control camera shake. The visual effects are now left to your imagination. You should now have the tools to explore various visual design concepts such as frozen action, peak of action, motion and blur, the notion of speed and long exposure photography. I hope this lecture has been useful in your development of your photographic practices and creativity. Remember, practice is essential to understand these concepts further. All the best and happy shooting.